Welcome to the Korea Society's live webcast. I'm Jayo, Senior Director of Arts and Culture. The Korean percussion music genre, Samulnori, is known around the world for its powerful rhythmic form. Based on both ethnographic research and close formal analysis, Professor Katherine In-Young Lee will demonstrate to us how this particular Korean music became one of Korea's key cultural exports and a global music genre on its own. Katherine In-Young Lee is Associate Professor of Ethnomusicology at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music. Her book, Dynamic Korea and Rhythmic Form, was published in 2018, and she received her PhD in ethnomusicology from Harvard University. Welcome to the Korea Society, Professor Lee. It's great to have you join us tonight.
Thank you.
A quick reminder to our viewers, you can send your questions via Twitter at Korea Society Art or via email artsandculture@koreasociety.org. And Professor Lee, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Jay, for that very kind introduction. I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to the Korea Society for this generous invitation to speak to you today. It's a real honor for me. And I just want to say hello to all of the viewers who have tuned into this webcast. Thank you. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to share some of my research on the South Korean percussion genre known as Samulnori. So in today's talk, I'm going to be discussing some of the main aspects of my research, which comes from my book, Dynamic Korea and Rhythmic Form, published by Wesleyan University Press in 2018. My research has been animated by this question of how does a musical genre go global? And related to that question, what compels people, often with very limited musical training, to learn how to perform music that may be culturally and geographically distant from them? So I take the South Korean percussion genre known as Samulnori as a case study to examine these questions. And this is based on long-term ethnographic, multi-sited research that I've conducted from 2005 to 2015. In my book, I argue that Samulnori's rhythm-based form has served as a critical site for cross-cultural engagement in its global circulation. This rhythm-based form has proven to be remarkably accessible and mobile over the past 4 decades. And I take the term dynamic, a word that is often used to describe Samulnori, and I develop this as an analytic to assert the portability and the accessibility of rhythm-based forms in global circulation. So today I'm going to be presenting work from the second chapter of my manuscript, where I discuss a popular Samulnori composition called Yeongnam Nongak. And I'm going to analyze this in terms of its dynamic rhythm-based form. This will connect to the book's primary argument. And so there's going to be these 3 basic sections to my talk today. But first, I would like to give you some context for my research and some basic information about Samulnori. So after over a decade of meeting various amateur and semi-professional Samulnori percussion groups in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia, I've been very curious as to precisely how and why this percussion music has traveled during the past 4 decades, in particular to places where a connection to South Korea is limited or even unexpected. I met many of these Samulnori groups when I worked as the overseas coordinator for Kim Deok-soo's Samulnori Hanulim ensemble in 2003 to 4, and also in the mid to late 2000s during my field research period. So here are just some of the groups that I've met over the years. This is Shinparam, a community ensemble based in the Twin Cities in Minnesota in the United States. They are composed of a diverse mix of Korean adoptees, their white adoptive parents, second-generation Korean Americans, international Korean students, and also non-Koreans with an avid interest in Korean percussion. Shinawi was formerly a Samulnori group based at Waseda University in Tokyo, where the majority of the members were Japanese. And here's a photo that I took of the group at the World Samulnori Festival in Korea in 2008. This was an all-Swiss female group that formed in Basel, Switzerland, that was active during the mid to late 2000s. Most of these women have actually traveled several times to South Korea to engage in intensive training in Korean percussion. And Hundrike Lang, who is pictured on the very far right, actually enrolled in the master's program for Korean percussion at the Korean National University of the Arts in 2012. This is an interesting case from France in that the members of this theatrical group called Théâtre du Soleil, directed by Ariane Manushkin, they had to learn Samulnori for one of their theatrical productions. But after the production finished, a few actors ended up continuing to play Samulnori together, and they even traveled, some of them went to Korea to attend the Puyo Samulnori school. So I met a few of these members in 2008 in South Korea. And this was a group called Canto del Cielo from Mexico. Originally, many of these female members were drawn to Korean culture through Korean dramas and ended up taking Korean language classes at the Korean Cultural Center in Mexico City. It was there that they first learned about Samulnori, and then they started to take lessons and formed their own group. So here is a photograph that I took of them at the World Samulnori Festival in Korea. I'm sure that there are some people in today's audience who are already familiar with what Samulnori is. But just in case, in order to get the sounds of Samulnori into your ears, I'm going to present a brief video clip of the Samulnori genre as performed by members of Kim Deok-soo's Samulnori Hanulim ensemble. I recorded this video in February 2009 at the Gwanghwamun Arts Hall. And you may want to adjust the volume slightly on your computer as you listen to this on your own end. Okay, are you all awake now? Just to note that that's dry ice that was used by the theater. The theater is actually not burning down at this point. Okay, so after conducting my research, I've come to believe that a musical genre's global reach often has much to do with the kinetic appeal of the music itself and its ability to connect with people. While there are a number of factors, such as the circulation of recordings, publication of notation, and performances and workshops led by Samulnori that have contributed to the outward transmission of this musical genre, I assert that the formal properties of Samulnori have served as an accessible entry point for the swift adoption of this musical practice by amateur enthusiasts around the world. In my book, I explore these contours of rhythmic form, and I employ a methodology that combines ethnography with formal analysis. And this is very deliberate on my part. In my field of ethnomusicology, many studies of global musics consider how music has traveled via structures of Western imperialism, the widespread diffusion of media technologies, and resistance movements. And while these other dimensions are absolutely critical for understanding the larger structures that shape the circulations of music, at the end of the day, I'm still left with this question as to how or why some musical genres go global and others stay put. In the case of Samulnori, I'm looking at a rhythmic rather than a text or a harmonic-based form, whereas linguistic, harmonic, or modal forms require degrees of cultural translation and training. A rhythm-based form, I believe, offers a point of entry that privileges the sonic and the somatic. It's this rhythm-based form that guides amateur enthusiasts or non-musicians on their transformative path from musical appreciation to actual musical performance. And this Samulnori as a case study in the larger conversation on the globalization of music presents a unique opportunity to witness the creation and the development of a musical genre and its transmission and transformation over time and place. So before moving on to the next section, I'd like to give you a bit more information on this Samulnori genre. And so the way that I'm using Samulnori in this talk, I'm going to have it refer to two things. One is the name of a percussion quartet that began as a modest musical experiment in February 1978 in Seoul. And two, the style of playing and the repertoire that was performed by the quartet that eventually gives rise to the creation of a new genre of Korean music that is called Samulnori, and this is rendered with all lowercase letters. This can be translated literally into four things play, which refers to the four percussion instruments that are featured in this type of music. So first, the quartet. The musicians that came to be known as the first or quote unquote original Samulnori quartet were in their late 20s when this quartet first formed. And these musicians grew up steeped in the world of traditional Korean music. And they drew on their knowledge of percussion music and dance in their musical rearrangement of lengthy communal rituals into an urbanized concert format. At this very first performance by the quartet in February 1978, the musicians performed a piece called Uttari Pungmul. And this was a musical arrangement of the various rhythmic patterns that come from two regions in Korea, the Gyeonggi and the Chungcheong provinces. And the rhythmic patterns derived from an older form of rural music and dance called Pungmul. So what was different about this performance was the presentational format. As opposed to standing or dancing while playing their instruments, the musicians sat on the floor, much as you see in that image there, playing the four percussion instruments that are central to Pungmul. To the ears of the audience members in Seoul, the first performances by the quartet were both new and familiar at the same time. The rhythms were familiar, but the presentational and the performance style were different. And excitement over these performances at the Space Theater spread by word of mouth. And by 1980, the quartet had attracted a real fan base. So they kind of became popular almost overnight, and then the group starts to tour internationally. The quartet also began to develop a working repertory based on the rhythmic variants of Pungmul. Within the span of just a few years, the repertory and performance style of the Samulnori quartet became so popular that its specific brand of percussion music inspired this new genre of Korean music. So today, Samulnori is regularly practiced and performed throughout South Korea, many diasporic communities, and in Europe, Japan, and South America. I did want to pause and mention the names of the musicians who appear in the image there. This is from a photograph that dates from 1980. So from left to right, we have Lee Kwang-soo, Kim Deok-soo, Choi Jong-sil, and the late Kim Yong-bae on the right. I'm going to say more about them later. At this point, what I would like to do is play a very, very short excerpt of Yeongnam Nongak, because it's going to segue from my description of the quartet to a description of the Samulnori genre, and it's going to also serve as a frame of reference for the rest of my talk. So here we go. Okay, I told you it was short. Okay, this excerpt of Yeongnam Nongak was performed by the Samulnori Quartet in 1983. The recording comes from Samulnori's first official tour of the United States, which was sponsored by the Asia Society in New York and the preeminent arts presenter, the late Beate Gordon. After this memorable debut performance, the quartet would later tour extensively on what we can call the world music circuit in Japan, Europe, and the United States during the 1980s. And Yeongnam Nongak, which translates into farmers' music from the Yeongnam region, would several years later become one of the most commonly performed pieces among amateur Samulnori ensembles around the world. So in 2008, during the World Samulnori Festival held in Puyo, South Korea, for instance, over 100 participants from ensembles representing 11 different countries traveled to South Korea to compete in a Samulnori competition and to perform in the festival's opening event. What bound them together musically was their ability to play Yeongnam Nongak. And so here are some images from that particular festival, which commemorated the 30th anniversary of the founding of Samulnori, in which I participated as a volunteer coordinator for. So here you can see an image of one of the rehearsals of all of the international groups learning and playing Yeongnam Nongak. And then here is the performance at the opening ceremony for the World Samulnori Festival in 2008. Okay, so in this next section of my talk, I'm going to provide an analysis of Yeongnam Nongak. And Yeongnam Nongak is significant in the context of global Samulnori. I really selected this piece for analysis because it is often the first Samulnori composition that beginning students will learn how to play as part of an ensemble. And Samulnori Hanilim's self-published notation books designate Yeongnam Nongak as the first or the fundamental piece of the series. And this composition can provide some clear challenges for the beginning student. The student must memorize the different rhythmic patterns and the sequential order. They need to learn how to feel the rhythmic groove and also learn how to play together as part of an ensemble. But even despite these challenges, Yeongnam Nongak is surmountable with the proper instruction and the right amount of practice. When Yeongnam Nongak is played in ensemble formation, the 4 different percussion instruments that make up its core function together as part of a larger interdependent unit. So here you can see the 4 instruments that are featured: 장구, which is a double-headed hourglass-shaped drum; the puk, which is a barrel drum; 2 gongs, one large and one small. Jing is the larger one, and kwingari is a smaller gong. So progressing through these different rhythmic patterns, the 4 instruments weave into a complex musical texture. Additionally, a rhythmic groove can emerge when performers are able to fully synchronize their beats within a cycle. So all of these combined elements make for an exciting piece to listen to and to perform. So thus far, I have been using the term composition or piece to talk about Yeongnam Nongak. And while this is by no means incorrect, the terms musical arrangement and adaptation may be equally valid. In Korean, the words 재구성, reconfigure or restructure, and 재창조, recreate, are frequently used to describe the first collaborative explorations by the Samulnori Quartet during the years 1978 to 82. The first presentation of what was eventually to become known as Yeongnam Nongak was in fact a musical arrangement of existing rhythmic patterns that hailed from the older genre of rural band percussion music and dance known as pungmul, or sometimes called Nongak. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, pungmul was once intimately associated with village life when the Korean peninsula was predominantly an agrarian society. So here's an image that I took in the village of Pilbong, which is in Imsil County in North Jeolla province. And farmers and villagers would perform this percussion-based music, pungmul, at important times of the agricultural cycle and for rituals and festivals. It was also used to encourage farmers while they engaged in manual labor. The arrangement of Yeongnam Nongak derives from a regional variant of pungmul that was performed in the cities of Jinju and Samcheonpo, which is in southeastern Korea. So although it's been associated with other labels at times, Jinju Samcheonpo Nongak refers to both the name of a regional band and the representative style of pungmul performed in the Yeongnam, also known as Gyeongsang region. And like other versions of pungmul, Jinju Samcheonpo Nongak is performed outdoors by a large number of musicians and dancers. So what I'd like to do now is play a very short video clip of Jinju Samcheonpo Nongak, which is this example of pungmul. And when you watch this, you will notice that the musicians are standing and moving while playing these rhythmic patterns. So there are kind of choreographies of movement. Okay. So performances involve the playing of particular rhythmic patterns called karak, which are then repeated as cycles for an indefinite number of times. Depending on the event, a performance can last for several hours. But despite this variability in terms of time or temporal duration, there is a basic organizational structure to Jinju Samcheonpo Nongak that features 12 sections with distinct rhythmic patterns, functions, and choreographies. It's this rhythmic repository that the Samulnori quartet drew upon to create their seated arrangement of Yeongnam Nongak. And so Samulnori's Yeongnam Nongak is smartly arranged music that includes an ebb and flow of musical activity. And this was really the result of experimentation and a process of musical arrangement that developed organically over the span of a few years. It was only later on, after musical notation and recordings emerged, that Yeongnam Nongak came to be thought of as a standalone, fixed composition. But even so, the arrangement or work has retained a degree of flexibility in performance. And so musicians can mutually agree upon the number of repetitions per rhythmic pattern, and thus they can expand or contract the length of a piece. This accordion-like effect accounts for the discrepancies and timings of Yeongnam Nongak recordings by the Samulnori quartet and also by Kim Deok-soo's Samulnori Hanelim group. With this variability and flexibility, then, what remains identifiable about the arrangement is the rhythm-based form of Yeongnam Nongak. So I talk about rhythmic form a lot in my book, and I define rhythmic form as a type of musical form whose foundation is based on the sequence of varying rhythmic configurations. These rhythmic configurations can be conceptualized or represented in a number of different ways. It could be social function, gesture, choreography, or cycle, just to name a few. In the case of Samulnori, which is not melodic, modal, harmonic, or text-based, The formal structure is really organized by the sequential arrangement of these individual rhythmic patterns, which are then repeated as cycles. Since the rhythmic patterns come from a genre that integrates both music and dance, the rhythmic patterns correspond to sections within Pungmul that have distinct movements and choreographies. And within the Samulnori form, the rhythmic patterns or the karak generally do not appear more than once in a sequence. So Samulnori's form is thus a sectional one. Now we're going to move a little bit deeper into the analysis, and we're going to look at the first section of Yeongnam Nongak. This begins with a rhythmic pattern called kilgunak. This can be translated literally as road military music. And this is a very important rhythmic pattern from Jinju Samchumpo Nongak. Unlike some of the other karak or rhythmic patterns that are more appropriate for dance, kilgunak is really tailored for kind of a walking or processional tempo. And in the back of the 2004 notational booklet that was published by Samulnori Hanelim, we see a graphic that looks similar to this figure. This figure depicts an aerial view of the choreography that a Pungmul band will follow during the kilgunak section. As the musical leader of the group, the kwengari, the small gong player, leads the musicians and other performers in a ground formation. This is called jinpo, that winds from one side to the other. And the movement of musicians gradually segues into this circular formation, which is depicted by the direction of the arrow in the figure. The number of times kilgunak is repeated is really at the discretion of the lead kwengari player. And here is a choreography, a figure of the choreography for the rhythmic pattern that immediately follows the kilgunak pattern. This is called pan-kilgunak. And many of you will probably recognize this figure as similar to the taeguk symbol, which you can find at the center of the South Korean flag. Okay, so with this choreographic element that is absent from Yeongnam Nongak, the Samulnori quartet played rhythmic patterns such as kilgunak in a seated position on a Western stage. And this elimination of dance and movement from Samulnori's seated works, the Anjunban, shifts the focus from the kinetic to the more sonic dimension of musical performance. And this shift enables the development of a kind of technical virtuosity that eventually became synonymous with the Samulnori quartet. The rhythmic patterns also develop more complexity in their variations. We can observe this in Samulnori's recordings of Yeongnam Nongak, where the kilgunak pattern, say it's repeated a total of 12 times, it will become especially intricate and difficult during the 10th, 11th, and 12th iterations of the cycle. And by these last repetitions of the kilgunak pattern, the opening section of Yeongnam Nongak then has increased dramatically in dynamic level and in intensity. And this is not surprising, given the quartet's level of musicianship and their technical mastery of their respective instruments. The members of the classic quartet, seen here when they were young, so on the left, you see the late Kim Yong-bae, Lee Kwang-soo in the middle on the top, Choi Jong-sil, and then Kim Duk-soo on the far right. I really love that image of when they were all young, but they were all masters of percussion who were also driven by this competitive spirit that emerged when they would perform together on stage. And in the 1983 recording by Nonsuch, which I would definitely encourage you to listen to in its entirety, these four musicians engage in a very memorable rendering of kilgunak, one that features an intensification in energy, crescendo and dynamic level, increase in number of drumming strokes or percussive strokes played, and a dramatic acceleration in tempo. This veers pretty significantly from what you observed in the video clip of Jinju Samchumpo Nongak that I played for you earlier, which was of the exact same Kilgunak pattern. Okay, so what you're looking at now is the musical notation that was developed by Samulnori. And you can see here a box type notation with circles that are meant to represent the strokes of the drum. And this is the Chango hourglass drum. Like many other musical traditions around the world, Samulnori relies on drumming syllables as part of its pedagogical practice. So in order to learn how to play these rhythms on the instruments, you would first learn how to recite the drumming syllables in time. These basic syllables are onomatopoetic, meaning they imitate the sounds that are meant to be produced on the drum. And so you can see some of these syllables here written in English. I believe that you should be able to see my cursor, tong, kung, ta, and kung. So these are really the basic drumming syllables. And now if I were to teach you Kilgunak in kind of a classic setting, I would teach you the drumming syllables first. Maybe we would tap along before we even touch the instruments. But you know, I can't do this in a virtual setting very well, but I will kind of speak the drumming pattern through so that you get a sense of how this works. This is a 36 beat cycle, and it's quite long in that sense, but the way that it is taught is that it's usually subdivided into smaller units of 2s and 3s. And so you can see some of my markings here. So let's try and say this together. Pong is the first one, and that actually represents striking the drum head on both sides. Pong, pong, kung, ta, kung. Pong, kung, ta, kung. This changes a little bit here. Pong, ta, kung, ta, kung. 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 Pong. And now we move to a smaller unit of 2. Pong, ta, kung, ta, kung. Pong. Pong, ta, kung, ta, kung, ta, kung. Pong. 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 Okay, so to say all of that is just one iteration of the Kilgunak cycle. Okay, so you can begin to see now how a rhythmic pattern such as Kilgunak works and how it is taught and how it is learned. You can also begin to imagine how other rhythmic patterns are taught and then combined together. The remainder of Yeongnam Nongak features the following rhythmic patterns, and I'm not going to discuss that, but you can see that in my book if you're interested. Now I'm going to move on to the next section of my talk where an analysis of rhythmic patterns like Kilgunak begins to reveal what I'm calling a dynamic rhythmic form. And I just want to pause for a moment and reflect on this word dynamic and its associations. We often use the word dynamic to describe people. Person with a dynamic personality is someone who has a lot of energy and vitality. We can also use this term to describe observable processes of change. In economics, for instance, we know that a dynamic economy bustles with activity. It has exhibited significant change, perhaps in shifting from an import-led to an export-driven imperative, or in the larger turn from agriculture to industry. So here, dynamic signals both change and progress. And connected to this is yet another definition of dynamic that is regularly employed in academic discourse, a force that stimulates change within a system or a process. And in music, we have a very specific usage for the term. A dynamic refers to the volume or the amplitude of a sound. So there are many more examples that I could provide for you, but the point to draw out here is that there is really a constellation of meanings for dynamic. And the common ones gesture towards motion, change, action, energy, and volume in sound. And so even despite this word's multivalence, we know intuitively what dynamic does not mean. Dynamic does not mean static, nor is it boring or monotonous. So I spend time thinking about these different meanings because the word dynamic is inextricably linked to the Samulnori genre. First, it's a strikingly frequent descriptor found in books, CD liner notes, programs, newspaper articles, and concert reviews. In a short introductory essay used in a program from a concert called Dynamic Korea, Kim Deok-soo noted that dynamism is an integral part of traditional music and culture. It is this feature, Kim claims, along with energy and playful spirit, that is expressed in Samulnori. Second, dynamism or dynamic are also words that many of my interlocutors have used when describing their own first encounters with witnessing a live Samulnori performance. And third, Samulnori's first national slogan, Dynamic Korea, becomes sonically linked to the genre in the early 2000s. I want to mention that I have written about dynamism in relation to South Korea's nation branding campaign, Dynamic Korea, which was launched in December 2001, just before the FIFA World Cup, which was co-hosted by Japan and South Korea in 2002. And in that article, which appears in the Journal of Korean Studies, I describe how the genre of Samulnori was employed in the nation branding campaign, and how the dynamic sounds of Samulnori actually challenged old nicknames of Korea as Land of the Morning Calm and the Hermit Kingdom. So here are some images from that FIFA World Cup in 2002. And some of you may know that Kim Deok-soo's Samulnori Haneullim group actually appeared prominently in the stands of the World Cup and served as sort of Samulnori cheerleaders to rally on the South Korean team and fans. So taking this range of meanings that are summoned by the word dynamic, motion, change, action, energy, and volume and sound, I believe that Yeongnam Nongak exhibits a dynamism in its formal structure. I attribute this partly to the fact that Yeongnam Nongak draws its source material from Pungmo, a multifaceted performance genre that integrates dance and movement with music. But it is also in the Samulnori Quartet's expert arrangement of various rhythmic patterns from Jinju Samchunpo Nongak that Yeongnam Nongak exerts a dynamic musical form. And this can be observed in this aesthetic. So it can be translated as produce, stir up, fasten, and release. 내고, 달고, 맺고, 풀고. And this is applied to the sequential order of rhythmic patterns that will intentionally bring out contrasts in volume, speed, and metric organization. So in a rhythmic context, this aesthetic refers to a certain degree of flexibility and tension that a performer can engage in during the course of performance. The set of contrasts or binaries relates most directly to when the regular beat is kind of slowed down and then quickly resumes its normal speed. At the same time, navigating between these two poles creates a kind of tension in the music that is often highlighted by the performer. So the way in which a performer renders this aesthetic indicates both skill and artistry. In describing similar musical aesthetics found in melodic music in Korea, noted Korean music composer and kayagum performer, the late Hwang Byung-gi explained, quote, melodies need to be repeatedly tightened and loosened. Tightening means gathering of him, strength or energy, somewhat like compressing a string. Many different techniques are used to accomplish this. Perhaps the most impressive method is to produce a sense of strain by increasing the rhythmic density and then after a climax, reducing it. In several places within Yeongnam Nongak's form, we notice these effects applied to volume, rhythmic density, meter, and tempi. And over the course of the piece, these effects produce a constant sense of dramatic activity and of motion. Okay, so it's this dynamic process of moving from one end of the spectrum to another in terms of volume, tempo, and degrees of intensity that will often captivate first-time listeners and kind of reel them in. But what makes Yeongnam Nongak accessible in performance to enthusiasts around the world are the rhythmic patterns that are simple enough for a non-musician to learn, that are repeated and then patched together to create a composition with a distinct form. Although it is an introductory level piece, Yeongnam Nongak features many of the formal elements that are common to other Samulnori pieces. So that would be a modular formal structure, a more macro progression from complex rhythmic cycles to ones more simplified and compressed, and significant contrast between tempi, volume, and levels of energy exerted in performance. I believe that the modular formal structure helps beginners to process and to learn individual sections while simultaneously providing an architectural template for the composition. In this sense, I believe that one of the Samulnori Quartet's greatest achievements was to design an elegant rhythm-based form that was deeply rooted in local rhythms, but was able to somehow become legible across cultural and national boundaries. So in a different version of this talk, I've continued on by giving a short introduction to one of the global Samulnori ensembles that is featured in my book. I've spoken about the Shinparam, traditional drumming group of the Korean American community in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, and as this group that plays quote unquote Pungmo on the prairie. The founders of the group are Martha Vickery and Stephen Wunrow, who are also the publishers of the Korean Quarterly newspaper based out of Minnesota. This is just a nice shout out to them. Please check out their newspaper, which is now digital. And here are some photos that they sent to me last October when they were able to rehearse outdoors in the fall, just before it became cold. And you can tell this was also during the time of COVID-19 because they're wearing masks. So I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the profile of Shinparam for you today, but I did want to play this very brief example of Shinparam performing at the Arirang concert in 2017. And I think by now you should recognize this pattern.
So we're very excited. We're doing a piece that's from southeastern Korea. It's called Yeongnam. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay, so connecting back to what I discussed in this presentation and by way of conclusion, I believe that Samulnori's dynamic rhythmic form has afforded its accessibility and its mobility as a global music genre. This rhythmic form, as I have shown, was derived from the rhythmic repository of Pungmo and then fashioned organically as musical arrangements into compositions such as Yeongnam Nongak. These rhythmic patterns that comprise the form have another life in that they are also associated with movement, dance, communal rituals, and large-scale choreographies. The sounds and rhythms are also associated with dynamism, a multifaceted dynamism that invites movement, energy, change, and intensification. And thinking more globally, Samulnori's dynamic rhythmic form has become a critical site for its cross-cultural encounters. The relative simplicity of discrete rhythmic patterns arranged into a sectional form gives amateur enthusiasts and non-musicians an opportunity to engage in a non-Western musical tradition. Here, form organizes, shapes, teaches, and navigates this otherwise unfamiliar sonic landscape. This, I contend, is the work of Samulnori's dynamic form, which has become legible across boundaries and led to global encounters and the formation of new musical communities around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. That was such a wonderful presentation. We learned so much about this genre. I wanted to start my question to you with when we think of music, just as a not an ethnomusicologist, not as a musicologist, when we think of music, people tend to think of melodies or chords. People tend to think of song. Samulnori is very particular in that there's no melody, as you mentioned. Um, what kind of emotion do you think it provokes? You talked about dynamism, you talked about, sort of that energy it creates. But when you are talking about percussion music, purely percussion music that is composed of rhythmic elements, what do you think it provokes in people, in the listeners?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and thank you for noticing, the kind of uniqueness of Samulnori as, instrumental tradition or something that is percussion based. Yeah, I think that, I would rely on what people have told me, the practitioners, the professional musicians, also some of my own personal experiences having taught Samulnori to students as well. I think when the sort of rhythmic groove is cultivated, and when people are able to fully synchronize their beats together, it's powerful because you are working in conjunction with other musicians. So on that level, it can just be exciting to perform. I do, want to note that when some of these folks that have listened to Samulnori live and experienced a very powerful kind of encounter with Samulnori for the first time, they often say dynamic. That's often a word that comes up, but they'll say it was, energy. It was incredibly energizing and moving. Some people just feel like they've never experienced that kind of music before. So it varies from person to person, but the people that I have most often talked with are commenting on this exciting nature of the music, and that sometimes it actually leads them to want to learn how to play this music. It's not just at the level of listening and appreciation, but they actually say, I want to learn how to play this. And I think that's a pretty transformative move.
And do you think that's this act you talked about how Samulnori is based on sort of the traditional music of the farmers, yet the radical change sort of they presented in the late 70s, early 80s is that they sat down on a stage and made a presentation. It wasn't just something that you heard on the background. It became a performance in a sense, right? So how radical was that? How different was that to actually the Korean viewers at the time? Do you know?
Yeah, I think I say in my talk and in my book that it was both novel and familiar. So on one level, the soundscape or the sounds were familiar. If you had grown up in a village, or if you had gone to festivals or seen or heard pumol, then you would understand, oh, these are the sounds, these are the percussion instruments, these are the kinds of rhythms. But to see it distilled down to 4 instruments played by master musicians, and also arranged into a form that is much more compressed from the pumol form, then I think it just seemed also very exciting and new. And I should mention that the musicians, when they were first experimenting and exploring these rhythmic patterns, they were fostered by musicians, or I should say they were fostered by Kim Soo-gun, the architect who built the Space building and the Space Theater, and also Kang Jun-hyuk, the late Kang Jun-hyuk, who was the kind of artistic director of the small theater at Space. And so these musicians were given kind of artistic or creative license to do this kind of exploration. But certainly they grew up steeped in the world of Korean music, so they knew all of these rich kind of rhythmic patterns, and then were able to create something in a new presentational style that was pretty different back then.
And we all understand South Korea. it has been sort of modernized and industrialized so quickly. And there seems to be this little, but a bit of a perception in Korea that what is new is better. And also there's this equation of what is Western is what is modern, sort of, getting rid of the old ways and all that sort of attitude. So what do you think is the role of traditional Korean music, which in Korean culture, in Korean, it's known as kugak. So what do you think is the role of kugak in Korea now? And do you consider actually, I guess, Samulnori as kugak, as part of, or is it a reiteration of kugak, or is it a new genre of kugak? Like, how do you see Samulnori within the kugak genre, I guess, the field? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for that really perceptive question. I would say Samulnori is neo-traditional. So on one hand, it draws from traditional rhythmic patterns that come from a much older form of percussion music and dance, that being pungmul. But then the presentational style was quite new, right? And I also talk about how the form was created through this process of musical arrangement. So I like to say neo-traditional, both to recognize the older historical connections to pungmul, but also to recognize that it is a distinct form that, if you look at it, is going to look very different from a pungmul performance. And so then to think about Samulnori within the context of the kugak world in South Korea, yeah, I think that Samulnori actually did a lot to kind of provoke an interest in kugak in Korea. So sometimes there is this phenomenon in Korean culture where you have to kind of receive recognition overseas in order for it to be reevaluated and given more value in Korea. So I think that is, something that happened with the Samulnori case, that they really received recognition, became popular on the world music circuit, and then that kind of provokes a new interest in Korean music. And this is also how many of the international enthusiasts became drawn to kugak. So sometimes I see Samulnori as a gateway into another world of kugak, which can be, pungmul, it can be pansori, it can be minyo, but Samulnori is the first thing that kind of draws them into this deeper exploration of kugak and Korean music.
And Samulnori really is used in many different settings in Korean life, actually. As you mentioned, in a lot of sporting events, they are sort of like play the role of cheerleaders. You also saw a lot of them sort of during the democratic movement, during the protests, or if there's any labor disputes and any strikes going on, then you see the Samulnori players. I guess it's also the adaptability and sort of the portability. You mentioned the portability of Samulnori as well, and the literal portability of the instruments that make it possible. Can you think of any other way how this Samulnori has been adapted into, not just as a performance art, but as sort of the part of the culture? That, do you think it's because, as you said, it is relatively easier to learn how to play percussion instruments and then say, let's say a piano or, string music, string musical instruments or things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think you actually answered the question with the examples that you gave. And thank you so much for mentioning, the use of Samulnori in sporting events. That was definitely a phenomenon that you saw during the 2002 FIFA World Cup and continue to see. And then, of course, the 1980s democratization movement in South Korea. And I did research on this as well, looking at the use of these percussion instruments in scenes of protest in South Korea. But I would say it's complicated. It's a complicated story. And the students who were the activists during this time period who were, learning how to play these percussion instruments actually identified more with pungmul, because it connected with this ethos of the common people and the farmers. We're learning the music of Koreans, of Korea's traditional farmers. And so in some ways, they kind of rejected the Samulnori phenomenon, even though it was happening at around the same time when Samulnori was performing on the world music circuit during the 1980s. But I see that there are actually, kind of these intersections where some of these students, did not grow up in farming villages. They actively had to learn how to play these rhythms. And so in some cases, they use the notation of Samulnori or listen to the recordings of Samulnori. And also Samulnori developed instrument manufacturing capacity. So things are actually more connected than mutually exclusive. But what you said about portability is absolutely right, because you can take these instruments with you. They're not that heavy. And there are also ways to attach the instruments to your bodies, like the chango, you wear sashes. So in that sense, it is portable. But I would also say that the rhythms are easy enough to learn so that anyone, I have evidence of this after having taught at UC Davis and taught many students how to play Yeongnam Nongak, that these rhythms can be learned by non-musicians.
Recently, the Korea Society hosted a virtual concert by a group named ADG7, Akdang Gwangchil, whose repertoire includes the traditional ritual music and minyo, the folk songs, but rearranged and reinterpreted. There seems to be this attempt to sort of modernize or adapt old sort of the traditional music is becoming more and more popular in Korea right now. Last year, there was a virtual sensation that is Inalchi. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it and you'll love it. They're great. But do you think this sort of new way of interpreting sort of the old word is the basis, basically the Samulnori, and what do you think is the role Samulnori plays now in Korea?
So yeah, some really interesting things to think about. I would say that, yeah, these kind of two groups that you've pointed out have kind of pushed boundaries in some ways, and they're combining elements of either pansori or minyo with maybe funk beats or different kinds of Western beats. And so they are doing their own thing. And as you said, this is a recontextualization of tradition. And in some ways that's connected to what Samulnori did in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So I see it as an extension of this reinterpretation of tradition. And I really like this definition of tradition that ethnomusicologist Henry Spiller has, where he talks about how tradition is not just stuck in the past, but it grows and changes along with the people that listen to it and create the music grow and change. So this is probably part of a longer trajectory.
Yeah, it is so fascinating to see these new groups coming out with such interesting music. Before we end, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a personal question. One thing I didn't mention in your very extensive CV is that you actually trained as a classical pianist when you were young, and you actually you have 2 BA degrees, and one of them is in performing piano. So, and my understanding is that you actually grew up in the United States. So what made you become interested in Samulnori, of all things?
Yeah, it's a long story, which I won't narrate for you now, but I would say that I've always been interested in music first and foremost. But when I was at the University of Michigan as an undergraduate, I actually started to take a lot of ethnomusicology courses, and I was in the Javanese gamelan ensemble. And so even though I was trained as a classical pianist, I was very curious about Korean music, but I did not have a lot of information about it at the time. So I went to do a master's in ethnomusicology at the University of Washington. That's first when I started to, I started to read about Korean music. And then it was in the early 2000s, after living in Korea, studying the language, studying the music, that I ended up working as a staff member for Kim Deok-soo's Samulnori Hanulim. So I was their overseas coordinator and worked with foreign presenters to either host Samulnori or to bring international artists to Korea. So in a weird way, I didn't enter Samulnori, this kind of community, through my musical background, but rather as a staff member. Yeah, and so that's actually how I got to know all these international groups, because I had to serve as the translator for them.
I bet. And you never know where life will take you, but I am so glad that it did, because we learned so much about this, really dynamic genre of music today. So we thank you so much, Professor Lee, for your time and your talk. We wish you all the best and stay healthy. And we hope you can come back sometime in the near future and tell us about different genre of Korean music.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Please stay healthy.
Yeah. Special thanks to Peter, our IT director, for making this live webcast a possibility, and to our intern Gia for doing all the social media outreach and gathering questions. And of course, our thanks to you, our members and viewers. We hope you will join us again. Check out what's coming up on our website, koreasociety.org, or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you and good night.